Welcome back, fellow curious minds. Thank you for joining me once again. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's explore another fascinating story together. The blood had barely dried on the theatre of Pompey's marble floor when Rome realized the terrible truth. Caesar's assassins had killed the dictator, but they had no plan for what came next. The senators who struck down the most powerful man in the world somehow believed that murdering Caesar would magically restore the Republic. Instead, they had just lit the fuse on 17 years of civil war that would consume the Roman world and transform it forever. March 15th, 44. C. The Ides of March. Julius Caesar lay dead with 23 wounds in his body, struck down by men who called themselves liberators. Brutus and Cassius expected the Roman people to celebrate their deed. They expected the old republic to rise from Caesar's ashes like a phoenix reborn. What they got instead was stunned silence, then chaos, then terror. Because killing a dictator is easy, building a stable government is hard, and in the power vacuum left by Caesar's death, 3 men would emerge who made Caesar look merciful by comparison. They would legalize mass murder, divide the known world between themselves, and fight the final war that would determine whether Rome remained a republic or became an empire. This is the story of the Second Triumvirate. The story of how the Roman Republic didn't just die, but was systematically executed, piece by bloody piece, until nothing remained but the corpse of a 1,000-year-old dream. The immediate aftermath of Caesar's assassination revealed just how unprepared the conspirators really were. Brutus climbed onto a chair in the Senate House and delivered a speech about liberty and the restoration of the Republic. But the senators weren't listening anymore. They were running for their lives, convinced that Caesar's veterans would storm the building, seeking vengeance. For 3 days, Rome held its breath. The assassins had control of the city center, but they controlled nothing else. Caesar's money was in the treasury. His papers were in his house. His will was with the Vestal Virgins. And most importantly, his legions were scattered across the Mediterranean, commanded by men who had sworn personal loyalty to the dead dictator. The key figure in those first crucial days wasn't Brutus or Cassius. It was Mark Antony, Caesar's co-consul and longtime lieutenant. While the assassins made speeches about freedom, Antony moved fast. He seized Caesar's private papers, gaining access to the dictator's plans, appointments, and most crucially, his enormous personal fortune. He then negotiated with Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, to get control of Caesar's house and possessions. On March 19th, just 4 days after the assassination, Antony demonstrated his political genius. Instead of calling for immediate revenge, he convinced the Senate to reach a compromise. The assassins would receive amnesty for their actions, but Caesar's will would be read, and his acts would remain valid. It seemed like a reasonable solution that might actually prevent civil war. But Antony had another card to play. At Caesar's funeral, he delivered one of the most manipulative speeches in Roman history. Standing before Caesar's bloody corpse, he read the dictator's will aloud. Caesar had left money to every Roman citizen and donated his private gardens for public use. Then Antony displayed Caesar's torn and bloodied toga, pointing to each stab wound and naming the senator who had made it. The crowd's mood shifted like a breaking storm. These weren't liberators. These were murderers who had killed Rome's greatest benefactor. The Roman people rioted, hunting through the city for anyone connected to the assassination. They built a massive pyre in the Forum and cremated Caesar's body. then tried to burn down the houses of Brutus and Cassius. The assassins fled Rome, never to return. But Antony's moment of triumph was about to be challenged by someone no one expected. A sickly 18-year-old boy who would prove to be the most dangerous politician in Roman history. His name was Gaius Octavius, but history knows him better as Octavian, and eventually as Augustus, Rome's first emperor. He was Caesar's great-nephew. But more importantly, when Caesar's will was read, Romans discovered that the dictator had legally adopted this teenager as his son and heir. When news of Caesar's death reached Octavian in Greece, his friends begged him to stay away from Rome. Going back meant certain death, they argued. He was just a boy with no political experience, no military commands, and no allies. Antony controlled Caesar's legacy now, but Octavian understood something that everyone else missed. Caesar's name had become more powerful than Caesar himself. The dictator's veterans didn't care about political compromises or senatorial amnesty. They wanted revenge for their commander's murder. And they wanted it from someone who carried Caesar's name. Octavian arrived in Rome in April of 44 B.C. and immediately began calling himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, emphasizing his adoption into the Julian family. When Antony refused to hand over Caesar's inheritance, Octavian did something audacious. He borrowed money and began paying Caesar's bequests to the Roman people out of his own pocket. The message was clear. Antony might have Caesar's papers, but Octavian was Caesar's son. The fragile peace lasted less than a year. By early 43 B.C., the tension between Antony and Octavian had exploded into open warfare, while Brutus and Cassius were raising armies in the eastern provinces. The Republic faced civil war on multiple fronts, with no legitimate government in sight. The Senate, desperate for any military commander who could stop Antony, made a fatal decision. They granted the 19-year-old Octavian extraordinary powers and sent him north with 2 experienced consuls to fight Caesar's former lieutenant. The battle came at Mutina in April of 43 B.C. It was a strange fight, where Caesar's adopted son fought Caesar's best friend on behalf of Caesar's murderers. Octavian and the consuls won, but both consuls died in the battle, leaving the teenager in command of their legions. Now the Senate learned what it meant to arm a Caesar. Instead of returning to Rome as their obedient general, Octavian marched on the city with 8 legions. The senators who had applauded his victory over Antony suddenly found themselves facing another would-be dictator. On August 19th, 43 B.C., Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus became the youngest consul in Roman history. He was 20 years old, and he controlled Rome through military force, just as his adoptive father had. The Republic's ancient constitution had become completely meaningless, but Octavian had learned from Caesar's mistake. Instead of ruling alone and making himself a target for assassination, he decided to share power. In November of 43 B.C., he met with Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus on a small island in northern Italy to negotiate the most sinister political alliance in Roman history. For 3 days, the 3 men bargained over the Roman world like merchants dividing merchandise. When they finished, they had created something new, the Second Triumvirate, a legally sanctioned dictatorship that gave 3 men absolute power over Roman territories and Roman lives. The Lex Titia, passed on November 27th, 43 B.C., granted Octavian Antony, and Lepidus extraordinary 5-year terms as triumvirs for reconstituting the Republic. In theory, they were supposed to restore constitutional government. In practice, they had just legalized the end of the Roman Republic. But their first act as triumvirs wasn't governance or military campaign. It was something far more chilling. The proscription lists. If you were a Roman citizen in late 43 B.C., the most terrifying sound in the city was the noise of hammers against wood. Every morning, crowds would gather nervously in the forum as workers nailed fresh tablets to the rostra, the speaker's platform where Rome's greatest orators had once delivered speeches about liberty and justice. These tablets contained names, hundreds of names, the names of senators, knights, wealthy citizens, and anyone else the triumvirs wanted dead. The proscription system was brutally simple. If your name appeared on the list, you were officially condemned to death. Anyone could kill you and claim a reward. Your property was immediately confiscated. Your family members were barred from holding public office. And there was no trial, no appeal, no mercy. The triumvirs justified this legalized mass murder as necessary for financing their war against Caesar's assassins. They needed money for their armies, and Rome's wealthiest citizens were convenient targets. But everyone knew the real truth. This was revenge, pure and simple, combined with old-fashioned greed. The numbers were staggering. The triumvirs condemned roughly 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians to death. That's roughly half of Rome's entire senatorial class, and a significant portion of its business elite. In a single stroke, they decapitated Roman society. Citizens would rush to the forum each morning to see if their names had been added overnight. Some men learned of their condemnation from friends who spotted their names before they did. Others discovered their fate when bounty hunters arrived at their doors with swords drawn. One victim reportedly said, upon seeing his name on the list, "Alas, my Alban farm has informed against me." His wealth had made him a target, just as it did for hundreds of others. Some managed to buy their way off the lists through enormous bribes. Others weren't so lucky. But the most famous victim of the proscriptions was a man whose death symbolized everything the Republic had lost. Marcus Tullius Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, and the last true voice of republican government. Cicero had spent months delivering speeches against Mark Antony, comparing him to his historical namesake and calling him an enemy of the Roman people. These philippics were masterpieces of political rhetoric, but they signed Cicero's death warrant. When the triumvirs drew up their lists, Antony insisted that Cicero's name be included. The old orator was fleeing toward the coast when soldiers caught up with his litter on December 7th, 43 B.C. According to Plutarch, Cicero faced death with dignity, sticking his head out of the litter and telling his killers, "There is nothing proper about what you are doing, soldier, but do try to kill me properly." The soldiers cut off Cicero's head and hands, the instruments of his oratory and writing. When they brought these trophies back to Rome, Antony ordered them nailed to the rostra where Cicero had delivered his greatest speeches. Antony's wife, Fulvia, reportedly took out her hairpins and stabbed Cicero's tongue repeatedly, a final act of vengeance against the man who had dared to oppose her husband with words. Cicero's death marked more than the end of one man's life. It represented the murder of free speech itself. The rostra where his severed head was displayed had once been the symbol of Roman democracy, where citizens could hear competing viewpoints and make informed decisions. Now it was a warning: speak against the triumvirs and join the dead. with their enemies silenced and their coffers filled with blood money, the triumvirs turned their attention eastward. Brutus and Cassius had spent 2 years building armies in Greece and Asia, promising to restore the Republic if they could defeat Caesar's heirs. The final confrontation between the old Rome and the new would come at a place called Philippi in September of 42 B.C. 2 massive armies converged on the plains near the ancient city where St. Paul would later establish one of the first Christian churches. On one side stood roughly 90,000 men loyal to Octavian and Antony. On the other, about the same number followed Brutus and Cassius in what they proclaimed was the last stand for Roman liberty. But the Battle of Philippi revealed just how far the Republic had already fallen. This wasn't a fight between political philosophies or constitutional principles. This was a clash between 2 sets of military strongmen, each claiming to represent the Roman people while leading armies composed largely of foreign allies and mercenaries. The first battle came in early October and produced a confusing result. Cassius defeated Octavian's forces on the right wing, while Brutus crushed Antony's legions on the left. Both sides could claim victory, but Cassius made a fatal error. Believing that Brutus had also been defeated, he committed suicide rather than face capture. With one of their leaders dead, the Republican cause lost crucial momentum. 3 weeks later, Antony and Octavian forced a second battle. This time, there was no confusion about the outcome. Brutus's forces broke under the triumviral assault, and Caesar's last surviving assassin fell on his sword as his army disintegrated around him. The Republic died at Philippi, not the constitutional system, which had been effectively dead for decades, but the idea of the Republic. The last men who genuinely believed in restoring senatorial government and constitutional rule lay bleeding on a Macedonian battlefield. What came next would be pure military autocracy, dressed up in republican language, but Roman in name only. After Philippi, the triumvirs divided the Roman world between themselves like victorious warlords. Antony, the senior partner and most successful general, chose the wealthy eastern provinces. Octavian took the more challenging western territories, including Italy itself. Lepidus, the junior partner, was essentially sidelined with only Africa under his control. This division seemed logical, but it contained the seeds of the final civil war. Antony's Eastern command brought him into contact with the most dangerous and charismatic ruler in the Mediterranean world, Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt. The meeting between Antony and Cleopatra at Tarsus in 41 B.C. was one of the most spectacular pieces of political theatre in ancient history. Cleopatra arrived in a golden barge with purple sails, dressed as the goddess Venus, while her servants posed as cupids and sea nymphs. The perfume from her ship allegedly drifted for miles, and crowds gathered along the riverbank to witness what seemed like a goddess arriving from the sea. This wasn't mere vanity. Cleopatra was playing a sophisticated political game. She was the last active pharaoh of Egypt, a brilliant woman who spoke 9 languages, and was the first Ptolemy ruler to bother learning Egyptian. Her kingdom was fabulously wealthy, but militarily weak, surrounded by Roman territories, and dependent on Roman protection for survival. By allying herself with Antony, Cleopatra hoped to preserve Egyptian independence while gaining access to Roman military power. For Antony, the relationship offered something equally valuable: unlimited funding for his military campaigns and a base of operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. But their alliance created a propaganda disaster. Romans had always been suspicious of Eastern luxury and foreign queens. When news reached Italy that Antony was living in Alexandria like an Egyptian pharaoh, complete with royal ceremonies and divine honors, Octavian gained the perfect weapon against his rival. The propaganda war between Octavian and Antony revealed how completely Roman politics had changed. This wasn't a debate about policies or constitutional principles. It was a contest of competing narratives, each side trying to portray the other as a traitor to Roman values. Octavian's message was simple and effective. Antony had gone native. He had abandoned Roman traditions for Eastern decadence. He was planning to move Rome's capital to Alexandria and rule the Mediterranean world as an Oriental despot. Worst of all, he was under the influence of a foreign queen who sought to enslave the Roman people. Antony's counter-narrative was more complex and less compelling. He portrayed himself as Caesar's true heir, the man who had avenged the dictator's murder and conquered new territories for Rome. Octavian, in this version, was a sickly youth who had stolen Caesar's name while contributing nothing to Roman greatness. The contest reached its climax in 34 B.C., when Antony and Cleopatra staged the donations of Alexandria. In a massive public ceremony, they declared their 3 children rulers of various eastern territories, effectively carving up the Roman East into new kingdoms under Egyptian influence. For Octavian, this was a gift beyond measure. Here was proof that Antony planned to dismember the Roman Empire and give its territories to his foreign mistress and her children. The man who had once served as Rome's consul was literally giving away Roman lands to foreigners. By 32 B.C., the Second Triumvirate had officially expired, but neither Octavian nor Antony was willing to surrender power. War was inevitable, but Octavian needed to make it look like Rome's war, not his personal ambition. In a brilliant propaganda move, he seized Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins and read it publicly in the Senate. The document revealed that Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria next to Cleopatra, confirming Roman fears that he had completely abandoned his homeland. The Senate declared war on Cleopatra, not on Antony directly. This allowed Romans who still respected Caesar's former lieutenant to support the war as a patriotic defense against foreign invasion rather than another civil conflict. The final showdown came on September 2nd, 31 B.C., in the waters off Actium on the western coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra had assembled a massive fleet, including Egyptian ships and crews alongside Roman vessels. Octavian's forces, commanded by his childhood friend Marcus Agrippa, were smaller but more cohesive and better trained. The Battle of Actium was supposed to be Antony's moment of triumph, his chance to prove that Eastern resources could overcome Italian unity. Instead, it became the most decisive naval battle in ancient history, determining the future of the Mediterranean world for the next 6 centuries. The fighting began at dawn, but the crucial moment came hours later, when Cleopatra's squadron suddenly broke away from the main battle and fled toward Egypt. Whether this was a prearranged retreat or a moment of panic, we'll never know. But Antony's response sealed his fate. Abandoning his fleet and his men, Caesar's former lieutenant leaped into a small boat and raced after Cleopatra's ships. In that single moment, he destroyed his reputation forever. Roman commanders were expected to die with their troops, not abandon them for a woman. Even Antony's supporters were horrified. The rest of Antony's fleet surrendered within hours. His land army held out for a week before going over to Octavian. The last challenge to Octavian's supremacy had collapsed, not through military defeat, but through moral failure. Antony and Cleopatra spent their final months in Alexandria, waiting for the inevitable end. Octavian took his time, letting them twist in the wind while he consolidated control over their former territories. When he finally invaded Egypt in 30 B.C., resistance crumbled immediately. Faced with certain capture, both lovers chose suicide over the humiliation of being paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph. Antony fell on his sword after receiving false news that Cleopatra was already dead. When he learned the truth, he had himself carried to her monument and died in her arms on August 1st, 30 B.C. Cleopatra's death came days later, probably from poison rather than the snakebite of popular legend. With her died the last Hellenistic kingdom, the final remnant of Alexander the Great's conquests. Egypt became Octavian's personal property, providing him with enormous wealth to fund his transformation of the Roman world. The boy who had arrived in Rome as an 18-year-old with no allies and no army now stood as master of the Mediterranean. Every rival was dead or defeated. Every army swore loyalty to him alone. The republic that had lasted for nearly 5 centuries had finally breathed its last. But Octavian's greatest challenge still lay ahead. He had won the war, but how could he win the peace? Romans had endured decades of civil conflict and military dictatorship. They were exhausted by violence and desperate for stability, but they still remembered what it felt like to be free citizens rather than subjects. The solution Octavian devised was a masterpiece of political theatre that would influence government systems for the next 2,000 years. On January 13th, 27 B.C., he appeared before the Senate and delivered a speech that officially ended the Roman Republic while pretending to restore it. Standing before the assembled senators, Octavian announced that his emergency powers were no longer needed. The civil wars were over. The Republic's enemies were defeated, and constitutional government could resume. He was therefore surrendering all his extraordinary commands and returning power to the Senate and people of Rome. It was a brilliant performance, but everyone knew it was theatre. The senators understood that rejecting Octavian's offer would mean civil war, while accepting it would mean acknowledging their own powerlessness. They chose survival over principle. Rather than accepting his resignation, the Senate begged Octavian to continue governing. They granted him a new name, Augustus, meaning the revered one. They gave him enormous provinces to govern, vast armies to command, and constitutional powers that made him effectively emperor in all but name. Augustus accepted these honors with apparent reluctance, creating the fiction that he was simply Rome's first citizen, ruling only because the Senate and people insisted. This system, called the Principate, preserved republican institutions, while concentrating real power in the hands of one man. The transformation was complete. The sickly teenager who had inherited Caesar's name had become something Caesar never achieved, a legitimate ruler accepted by both the Roman elite and the common people. The Republic was dead, but the empire would last for another 1,500 years. The 17-year collapse from Caesar's assassination to Augustus's settlement reveals how fragile political systems really are. The Roman Republic hadn't died suddenly in 44 B.C. when the daggers struck. It had been dying slowly for decades, weakened by military strongmen, constitutional crises, and the impossible contradictions of governing a Mediterranean empire through city-state institutions. Caesar's assassins thought they could restore the past by killing one man. Instead, they discovered what every revolutionary learns. Destroying the old system is easy, but building something better is almost impossible. In the chaos that followed Caesar's death, Romans learned that the alternative to dictatorship wasn't necessarily freedom. Sometimes it's just different dictators fighting over the corpse of the state. The Second Triumvirate represents something unique in political history. The moment when three men legally divided a civilization between themselves and systematically murdered their way to absolute power. They didn't seize control through military coup or popular uprising. They passed a law making themselves dictators, then used that legal authority to eliminate anyone who opposed them. Perhaps most chillingly, it worked. The proscription lists didn't spark revolution or resistance. They created terror so complete that opposition simply vanished. When the triumvirs finished their work, they had eliminated not just individual enemies, but the very idea that anyone could safely challenge supreme power. Augustus's final triumph was making this system seem natural and necessary. By the time he died in 14 A.D., Romans couldn't imagine governing themselves any other way. The Republic wasn't just politically dead, but intellectually extinct. Even the memory of genuine self-government had faded. The transformation from Caesar's assassination to Augustus's coronation reminds us that democracy isn't the natural state of human societies. It requires constant maintenance, constitutional safeguards, and citizens willing to defend it, even when that defense is difficult or dangerous. When those conditions disappear, the journey from republic to empire can happen faster than anyone expects. It took Rome 17 years to travel from the Ides of March to the Principe of Augustus. But by the time Romans realized where they were going, it was already too late to turn back. The Republic was dead. From its ashes had risen something the ancient world had never seen, a Mediterranean empire that would reshape the future of human civilization. The boy who had once been Caesar's heir had become something far greater and far more terrible. The first emperor of Rome, ruling over a world that would never be free again. And that's where we'll leave things for today. Thank you for listening, as always. If this journey sparked your curiosity, there's plenty more to explore. So stay tuned. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and never stop looking back to understand the road ahead.